Welcome, welcome, welcome to Equity Consulting Group's Spooky Secrets to Creating Inclusive Classrooms webinar. Equity, engagement, and a hint of Halloween. Welcome, y'all. So, Equity Consulting Group, we are a collective of educators working together towards the transformation of organizations in pursuit of equity and justice for all. So we work in schools with nonprofit organizations, all in service of students, y'all. My name is Jacoby Bell. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And for this hint of Halloween, my name, also known as today, is the Engagement Enchantress. Y'all, I always mess up that word, and I'll probably mess it up every time I use it today. So praise in advance. But engagement is my jam. I've been a literacy educator for years. I've been a teacher in elementary, middle, high schools, been literacy coach, network administrator. I've done the gamut. And one of the things that is dear to me are the students and the work, and that what keeps me coming back for more and more. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Colleen Hine Rogers.
Hey, y'all. Good evening. Hey. Well, I hope Halloween is one of your favorite holidays because, y'all, we're going to be a little corny tonight, but we're going to be making some connections to the fun of Halloween, the scary of Halloween, and just the excitement that it brings up for kids especially. So thanks for joining us this evening. As Jacoby said, my name is Dr. Colleen Hine Rogers. Where do I start? I'm always like, you start at the beginning, start at the end. I'll just say a few things that, number one, math is my jam. I am out loud and proud to be a math geek and a math nerd. I started my career as a chemical engineer and made the transition. So shout out any career changers, right, that entered education. I joined the field 21 years ago. That's a long time, y'all. But I started as a middle school math teacher in Philadelphia Public School District, and then moved on to instructional coaching, administration, district consulting, all in math, thinking about building capacity of teachers and teacher leaders, and really wanting for students the kind of experience that lights them on fire, right? That gives them strength in the possibilities of who they can be in STEM spaces and classrooms, and gives them that confidence to pursue whatever dreams they have. So I'm really passionate about math education, math identity, and just liberating practices as a whole. I'm also a girl mom. I have 2 daughters, so I also think about my students. And I think about my children when I'm in those spaces. So I'm excited to be here with you guys tonight. You can call me the mathematical magician.
Woo-woo.
All right, so I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, the last of our panelists, Dr. Reshma Ramkalawan, to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. So glad to be with you all here tonight. My name is Dr. Reshma Ramkalawan. Pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am your curriculum conjurer this evening. I believe in the power of education to serve as an intentional equalizer. And I believe in the power of curriculum to afford our students really robust and thoughtful educational experiences. I'm a bit of a curriculum nerd. I can probably geek out all day talking about all the cool ways you can adapt curriculum to make it fun and engaging and spicy for children. Formerly a classroom English teacher, I've been in education a long time. I don't even know if it's I don't even know where to begin. I was a substitute teacher at the very beginning, school leader, team leader, assistant principal. I've held a number of different roles. So I believe in education. I believe in its power because I've seen it from a number of different vantage points. I'm really happy to be with you all here tonight again, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jacoby.
All right. Our journey today. We are going to start in the haunted hallway of equity and talk about those monsters and those challenges that keep us up at night. And then we're going to do a little trick-or-treating and decide what we want to keep and, what we want to stay away from. And then we're going to end with the closing. So with that, I'll pass it to Reshma.
So thank you for that, Jacoby. As we jump into the haunted hallway of equity, we wanted to level set and get clear on some terminology that'll be pervasive throughout our conversation this evening. We're using this metaphor of a monster because, as Colleen said, we're being a little corny. It's Halloween. I don't think it's corny. I think adults love dressing up these days and like doing all the Halloween things. It's in fact, but we are like leaning into that spirit of Halloween and talking about some of these sticky points that tend to come up in our educational practices as monsters. So you'll see this extended metaphor in our description of 3 challenges that educators are currently facing in their practices today. These concerns, these monsters that continue to come up over and over again, primarily land in 2 buckets. They fall within the category of or bucket of equity, and they fall within the bucket of inclusion. And these 2 concepts go hand in hand when we're thinking about creating truly robust opportunities for all children to learn and all children to have access to quality instructional experiences. By equity, we're referring to this idea of whose voice is being privileged in the work and how are their needs being met across numerous subgroups. And by subgroups, we're referring to this concept of race, economics, class, schooling structures, you name it. That's what we're taking into consideration. Language. By inclusion, we're referring to this notion of, do students feel a sense of belonging and value? Do they feel psychologically and emotionally safe in their school spaces? And so the 3 monsters that we're profiling are going to touch on each of these, and we're going to definitely provide you with some antidotes and weapons, safe weapons, to vanquish these monsters in your own way. I'm going to turn it back over to Jacoby.
Thanks for that, Reshma. So as we go to the next slide, one monster that's keeping me up at night that I see over and over is the segregation of students based upon language. So sometimes I walk into classrooms and I see all the students that speak English, like on the rug in front, engaging in an interactive read aloud. And then I see students who English is not their first language, sitting towards the back of the room on iPads, or laptops, on learning platforms, right? But many times actually on YouTube in reality. And this segregation in class creates this linguistic hierarchy, right? The privileging of one language over another. And it impacts how students can see each other and even themselves. And so when we think about building inclusive classrooms where there's positive to student relationships, student to teacher relationships, and when we think about a sense of belonging, or even when we think about just classroom engagement and being engaged in the lesson with your peers, right? Like this is an equity issue. And so stealing some language from Reshma, one thing that I've been leaning into when I think about slaying this dragon is this idea of translanguaging. And so when we think about translanguaging, we think about allowing students to use their full language repertoire to engage in learning. So if they know 2 languages, 3 languages, however many, they can use these to engage in learning. And what undergirds this idea of translanguaging is the stance that we need to validate, celebrate, and build on students' complete multilingual identities as a way to empower language minoritized children and dismantle linguistic hierarchies in schools. And then underneath the stance, after embodying the stance, then we can begin to think about, well, what does this mean when I plan my lessons? So on to the next slide, I talk about 2 specific ways that this shows up in classrooms. The first way is in the intentional planning that educators engage in, right? So it means when you choose a book or a mentor text, you choose one that's in multiple languages. Or it means planning thoughtful language objectives in your lesson. Or if you're showing a video in class, maybe putting subtitles on in a different language. Or if you're introducing vocabulary, also introduce the cognates, and so forth and so on, right? So these are like what you intentionally plan for. This other bucket, translanguaging shifts, they're the unplanned moments that you experience in class. So for example, I was in a class this week, a dual language class, and the teacher asked a question, and the student answered in Spanish, right? And in that moment, the teacher had two options, right? One, she could be like, this is English class, please only speak in English. Or she could affirm that student's linguistic repertoire, right? So in this case, the teacher said, oh, I love it. Like, knowing multiple languages is your superpower. Who can translate for me what so-and-so said? And it was such a beautiful moment of like validating and affirming that student and their knowledge in that language. And it was a great way. It was just beautiful. It gave me chills, you know? Anywho,
I can imagine being in that space. Yeah, those beautiful moments do happen often in schools when we're there and observing. I do have a question though, right? So if we think about, and I think that teacher probably handled it ideally, but when we think about teachers who perhaps aren't bilingual and, you know, their only language is English, how would you recommend that they navigate those spaces with maybe multiple languages in a single classroom? What do you recommend there? How can they still lean into those pedagogies and kind of strategies for liberation? Yeah, that's what I'm curious about.
That comes up so much, Colleen, especially for languages that aren't as common, or sometimes even for languages that are common, but that folks don't happen to speak.
Yeah.
And so I think in terms when it comes to the translanguaging shifts and those unplanned moments is leaning into accepting and validating and asking someone else for that translation. And it comes from like standing in that validation, making those decisions out of that. Now, when it comes to translanguaging design, I think one of the easiest places to start for folks is with language objectives. Thinking about what is the intentional language that we're going to teach students that day, and how can we provide access points for them to not only learn that, but to engage in the learning as well. And so to do that, I usually start with 3 planning questions, which are on the next slide. So that was a perfect segue, Colleen. And the planning questions are like, what are the language demands that the task or objective will demand of students? What are the content demands? And then like, what are the cultural considerations that might need to take place in terms of understanding the text or the communication in the classroom? And so once you have kind of thought about these 3 things, you can think about access points for these 3 areas within the lesson plan. So to start off with your language objective, and shout out to Dr. Jose Medina. If you want to be blessed, check out his YouTube reels, y'all. Anywho, so language objectives. So they usually start with teaching about what is the skill. So research shows that for students to acquire language, they need to read, write, listen, and speak it. And so we think about like, what is the action verb that we want kids to do that day? Is it to define? Is it to write? Is it to argue? Is it to orally describe, right? And then think about the content that's being taught that day. So in this example, it's geometric shapes. So I can orally describe geometric shapes and then include the interaction. Will it be with the text? Will it be with a partner, etc.? So in this example, to a partner. And then what's the access point? And what's like the language learning strategy, which in this case is, and identify those that are cognates. So I find this is a very explicit, tangible way that educators can start their journey of being inclusive within their classrooms. So a good place to start, I know there's so many resources out there, y'all, and a lot of books on theory. And on the next slide, I have put a resource that I love. This is a translanguaging guide for educators from CUNY. In it, you'll find examples of translanguaging lesson plans. You'll find artifacts of student work that includes translanguaging, and also videos as resources. So if you're wondering where to start, check this link out.
You know, Jacoby, I was just about to ask you what are some places or where are some good places that we can begin? Because there's just so much out there and a lot of educators don't know where to even start. Especially if you are, like Colleen asked earlier, if you're a monolingual educator and you have students who are coming in who speak a language that you don't know, where do you even begin? So I'm hoping that this will be, I believe, because you are very good at vetting good resources, this is going to be a solid foundation for folks. There's also a lot of like generative technology that helps to translate content for teachers too, which is just one arm of the translanguaging that you were referring to. So thanks, Jacoby.
Yeah, awesome. I'd also recommend people check out WIDA. WIDA is another website. That is a great starting place as well. So with that, Colleen, I want to know, what monsters are you trying to slay?
The Monster Slayer. Thanks, Jacoby. And thanks for that information. You know, as a math geek, I'm always curious about the world of literacy and the mechanics of it and how that works and how we continue to kind of embed it really across the curriculum. So we're going to take a slightly different angle, because the monster that keeps me up at night has to do more with a systems level problem. You know, it's what Heifetz calls that wicked, that adaptive problem that has lots of different kind of causes and effects. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is the invisible and oftentimes unmet needs of this novice teacher workforce, particularly in content, pedagogy, and liberating mindset. And so that is the monster that I want to spend some time talking about. And for me, on the next slide, it makes sense to kind of take a step back to think about, as we emerged out of COVID, or I should say the global pandemic. COVID is still among us. But as we kind of came out of that virtual learning period and post-COVID, we saw teacher shortages become an epidemic in the educational world, right? And so this map just visually creates some urgency as we see the effect size of the need around teacher shortages. And so as a result, we know that states began adapting and changing their certification requirements, you know, and beginning to employ creative ways to meet the needs of students, right? We have to have bodies in the rooms and some semblance of instruction happening for students, because we know that's what they deserve and that's what we promise them. And so here in New Jersey, shout out to Jersey folks. I live in New Jersey, and actually this summer, June of 2024, the governor signed an act in place that eliminated the requirement for that testing, that basic praxis testing, which evaluates kind of the basic reading, writing, and mathematical skills of novice teachers entering the workforce. I think the point was to kind of remove a barrier and to open up the pipeline so that we can get more teachers in seats and in schools. Unfortunately, we know that the impact of this teacher shortage, as we look across the country, has been felt most acutely in particular specialty areas, namely science, mathematics, and special education. And y'all, that sounds like what I heard when I entered the field back in 2003, to be honest. Like, those three areas have always had an unmet need. And so to see that gap grow was scary, right? It was a monster, because it's like, well, what are we going to do? And so the novice workforce we know that is entering now has content knowledge gaps because perhaps they didn't intend to be a teacher. They have pedagogical gaps because it's like, okay, I may know the content really well, but I have no idea how to teach it effectively to middle schoolers. And then lastly, but significantly, many of them enter with high anxiety around meeting the needs of students. And so in practice, this is evidence. What I've seen in schools and districts that we've worked with is a level of disengagement, a reduction in rigor, and a dismissal of research frameworks that we know work, like universal design for learning and also culturally relevant pedagogy. You know, we're kind of going back to the era where that's being seen as like, oh, maybe I'll do it if I get a chance and if I want to, right? It's no longer being seen as like integral to instruction and kind of that sense of equity and inclusion. And so those are needs that we have. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about what districts are doing, right? So not just trouble up the problem, but what are solutions happening in the field? And there are quite a few. I do want to name first, though, that we know that the percentage of teacher shortages still remains pretty high. Coming into the 2022-23 school year, it's about 44% of public schools across the country began the year with vacancies. And unfortunately, we know that that scale and that balance is oftentimes tilted in a way that impacts communities that already have communities with high poverty levels, and also those communities that serve mostly students of color are disproportionately affected by this gap, right? Thinking about that trickle-down effect of teacher shortages and what that means to the quality of education. And so looking at those solutions that districts have come up with across the country, there's been some districts where, you know, we're opening the door wider to retired teachers, right? They have such wealth of knowledge and can bring such value to schools and classrooms. So districts are reaching back out like, come back, help us, right? Finding ways to expand candidate pools, like hiring non-certified teachers, right? So that alternate cert pathway. Also turning to veterans, right? I know there's always been a program, I believe, for veterans and to enter into teaching, but really recruiting harder in that initiative and leaning into their leadership capacity and skills. Increasing teacher salaries. Hello, more money, please. Yes, we all deserve it. And so looking at that as a way for motivation, extrinsic incentives, of course. So increasing teacher salaries. And then for some, looking at that longer term trajectory around what does this look like to develop our current students into future teachers, right? So we don't find ourselves kind of repeating this cycle. And so states like Arkansas, Colorado, Massachusetts, Michigan, North Carolina, and Texas are all kind of using some of these inventive and creative ways to expand the pipeline and really focus on teacher recruitment.
You know, Colleen, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around how we can keep early career educators in the seats that they're in, more so than historically been done. Are there any socio-emotional things that we need to tap into ensuring that they feel psychologically safe in their school spaces? And a little birdie told me that maybe you might have some research on that.
Perhaps. First, let me say, and on the next slide, we kind of lead right into that. So really, there's been a lot of focus around recruitment, and that work needs to continue, right? We do need teachers coming into the doors that are as qualified as possible. But what I want us to begin to shift our focus on is like, what does it look like to develop this novice workforce? And what does it look like to retain them, to your point, Reshma? And so my doctoral research was on really healing the mathematical trauma of novice teachers, particularly in the elementary schools, in order to increase their effectiveness and to transfer efficacy in mathematics to students. I think one bright spot or one win, one rose, when I think about roses and thorns, one rose that came out of COVID was a specific focus on teacher wellness. And by that, I mean like teacher well-being, like mental health. I know one teacher development organization, won't call any names, but the largest in the country, they pursued a partnership with Better Health, I think it is, and paid for therapy for their new recruits, for new teachers. Not as a way to say like, oh, let us heal all your problems, but really as a recognition that teaching is a mentally, rigorous, exhausting, all those words come to mind when I think about the work of teaching and sustaining that work. And so to answer your question, I think we need to continue that focus. We should continue to support teachers in their wellness. And in my capacity as a mathematics coach, I think about how do we also help teachers kind of explore and interrogate their own socialization about who they are in mathematics and their identity in that place, and heal any places that were traumatic for them in their own schooling. And so that work I'm really excited about. And I think COVID really opened the door for that to continue. So I'm excited about that. Moving on to the next slide. I love how Dr. Bettina Love really frames this as like, we want to do more than survive, y'all. It's time to move into our thriving era in schools, in districts. And so really thinking about, right, if we say we love children, we have to begin to reimagine, rethink, expand our thinking on what's possible in schools. Schools built on justice, love, joy, and anti-racism is what is required in our work. And I'm excited that in our work as consultants, we take this lens, regardless of if we are coaching in literacy or in math, we maintain an equity lens in that work. And so we get to make those connections and help teachers kind of build their capacity there. All right, so thinking about solutions, right? We're not just here to trouble up, bring out the boogeyman. What I want to encourage on the next slide, districts to begin to kind of shift is in adopting and developing a school-wide culture of professional learning. So getting back to that place, right, of increasing knowledge around frameworks that are research proven. We think about UDL, right, and those opportunities for students to have multiple ways of engaging, of representing their thinking, whether it is in multiple languages or just in the ways that they conceptualize the learning. Thinking about that as freedom. The second piece is around continuing to work on mindsets. I know over the last decade that we've been in business, there's been a large push around culturally relevant pedagogy, around mindsets, around CRSE, and that's been amazing. But as we think about this new novice workforce, we basically have to assume they didn't get that, right? So how do we get back to that place where we are continuing to prioritize that work, those asset-based pedagogies, the ways in which we talk about and see students, and the expectations that we hold for them and ourselves. And then lastly, I'll name this idea around building capacity around the skill of curricular literacy. I know Reshma's going to get into this a little deeper, but I just want to name, for those districts who are privileged to have strong materials, we got to get to that place where we are making it better. How do we adapt it? How do we make it more culturally relevant and accessible for all of our students? That is the work of teachers now. Whether you're working with I Am as a curriculum or iReady, any of the I's, our work as teachers is not to pick up this thing that was designed, for anybody. It is to make it our own, and it is to make it work for the students in front of us. So those are my tidbits and solutions.
Colleen,
Yeah.
I hear you saying that essentially we need to ensure that our professional learning with educators is culturally responsive, right? You talked about changing mindsets, which is the critical consciousness piece. You talked about increasing knowledge. That's the high expectations and rigor piece. So it's interesting that so often we focus on cultural responsiveness for students, but how we need to replicate that for adult culture as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we also have to just recognize that the reality for schools and districts are hey, we don't want to rock the boat too much. We need to keep people in the buildings.
Yeah.
And so that fear is real when it comes to teachers. And we need to continue to develop their capacity to not do harm to our babies. Wow. And so holding both those truths, I think, is really important. And not allowing teachers or ourselves to see these important kind of companions to learning as oh, maybe I'm not so sure I'm interested in that, right? Or I don't have time to do that thing. Seeing it kind of as an add-on as opposed to integrated. So yeah, that's my push. And then the last slide, we have a link to drop in the chat. We got gifts, y'all. 2 resources, right? So one is this amazing framework that New York State put together, culturally responsive and sustaining education. And what I love about it is that it has something for everyone. It speaks to multiple stakeholders and really lays out a clear charge, if you will, around how to make progress around CRSE. So no need to kind of reinvent the wheel there. If it's something that your district can use or was thinking about creating, yeah, we do a lot of borrowing and holding on to, right, in education. So I would definitely recommend you check out that resource. And shout out to us, y'all, during COVID. We had the opportunity to become authors. So check out our book. We're going to drop the link there. More than it being about us, because we love many books. We are quite voracious readers. And so we could probably give you 50 books that you should be reading. But this one in particular is a compilation of stories, of studies, of action. And so I think it's a great start if you're thinking about a book study or just your personal reading on your journey, knowing that we're each in slightly different places. And so this may give you some inspiration, some encouragement, and just some validation in the work that you may already be doing. So we're going to drop those resources in the chat. I think I'm done.
Thanks, Holly. I want to know what monster Reshma wants to slay. Who are you trying to slay? What you trying to slay, Reshma?
I'm going to slay the curriculum. But before we talk about slaying the curriculum, I want to just name that I love when the universe just offers a synergy very naturally. You don't even realize it. So two ways the universe is kind of speaking to our work. When in Colleen's talking about the CRSE framework that New York State put together and our book, many of the authors of the CRSE framework are like intellectual heavyweights in this concept of culturally responsive and sustaining education. And those same heavyweights are cited and referenced in our book because they're inspirations to us. So you have Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, you have Django Paris, you have Gloria Ladson Billings, like their work just like so there's a nice like energy between the two there. And then the other is the monsters that we're talking about slaying, they are parts to a whole. When we were planning this webinar to grace you all with some wonderful tidbits and solutions for slaying the monsters, we each had like topics that were top of mind. And the way that they've kind of come together tonight is just wonderful because you can't really think about them separately. You can, but you need one for the other. So I love that there's a bit of a parts to the whole energy there, which brings me to our school level monster number 3, curriculum adoption and adaptation struggles. And as Colleen and Jacoby spoke beautifully about the importance of humanizing our students' learning experiences from a funds of knowledge perspective, whether it's from the stance of acknowledging their intellectual readiness. And I'm using this term readiness from Carol Ann Tomlinson's research around differentiation and really meeting students where they are, what are they ready to do, as opposed to using the language of what are they able to do, which often comes from a deficit-minded standpoint. Whether it's coming from believing in their intellectual readiness or maintaining a blue sky vision for academic excellence, we believe that educators have their students' best interests in mind. And so as your curriculum conjurer this evening, I want to take a few minutes to discuss the recent movement to implement high quality curricular materials into classrooms, specifically in literacy and math. Some might argue that this initiative arose from a podcast decrying Lucy Culkin's workshop method and approach in New York City public schools. And there might be some truth to that. But others would say that the initiative stems from a desire for a universal approach to teaching. Regardless of where the initiative might have stemmed from, the rollout of high quality instructional materials has been met with a lot of struggles, even though the impetus behind it is well-intentioned. And so with that framework or with these tensions in mind, I want to name a quote that comes from Stephanie Hirsch and Jim Short's work, The Elements of Transforming Teaching Through Curriculum-Based Professional Learning. The quote says, "There is a long-standing myth that creative lesson planning is the mark of a great teacher. A more consistent, equitable, and common sense approach would be to relieve teachers, the emphasis on that word of relieve, teachers of curriculum development responsibilities and let them focus their energy where it matters most for student outcomes, on classroom instruction." If we free up the headspace for teachers to have to think about the instruction that they're designing, but rather give them materials and say, you now have the ability to adjust and modify, maintaining rigor, of course, these instructional materials for your students. There's so much power, potential, and creativity that goes into being able to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Who remembers? Don't you guys remember staying up all hours of the night writing lesson plans from scratch? Yeah.
And I, as a curriculum nerd, I love writing curriculum. I love talking about it. I love engaging in that. And there's something so beautiful and powerful when we get to see curriculum come alive in a really authentic and genuine way. I think about a curriculum that we designed for high performing charter network in New Jersey, and the high school English teacher, shout out to Miss Fagan, he dressed up as a pilgrim to teach the Crucible. And the way she brought this very I don't want to say traditional because it's not really a traditional lesson, but this lesson around characterization to life by dressing up as a pilgrim and asking you to think about whether one of the characters was the quote unquote side piece, right? It was just so fun and engaging to see her annoyance of the classroom. But none of that was scripted in the lesson plan. She took it, she maintained the rigor, and she still brought it to life. That's what we're trying to get across, and when we're thinking about high quality instructional materials. What are high quality instructional materials? There are a lot of definitions out there, but the ones that the attributes, I should say, that we're referring to when we use this term are essentially instructional content, instructional lessons that are aligned to the standards, backed in research, content rich, culturally relevant, have explicit directions and guidance for teacher support, so not leaving them out floating in the wind, offer assessments that are aligned to the instructional content that's provided, and the student materials are accessible, adaptable, and based on standards. We are currently based in the tri-state region, which if you're not familiar, that's New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. If you haven't gotten that from our shout outs to Jersey, shout out to New York, Jacoby and I. And we specifically work with a few schools in the New York City Department of Education. They've recently adopted several options for HQIM materials in literacy and math. As with any large initiative, there are always hiccups and roadblocks, and we've noticed a few specific patterns that often result in frustration from the top to the bottom of the instructional blockchain. And by top to bottom, we're thinking about system, we're thinking about the folks who are choosing the curriculum, all the way down. I hate this binary language of top versus bottom, but the students are the ones who are receiving the trickle-down effect of choosing this curriculum. And so the tension points that we're hearing primarily stem from educators feeling as though I've been teaching for X amount of time if I'm a veteran teacher, or I'm a new teacher and I've been taught these things of how to teach students, and I'm being told I have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, which is dangerous, as Colleen might tell you. Like, it's just like, let's not do that.
Do not throw out the baby with the water.
Like, we're not trying to, throw the children out at all. But there's this sense of fear that comes from this idea of fidelity versus integrity with the implementation of these high quality instructional materials.
Yeah.
And we're defining this idea of fidelity as, in terms of our operational approach, fidelity refers to teaching every component of the lesson plan as bulleted out, as mapped out on the lesson plan. Mm-hmm. Whereas integrity offers the teachers the opportunity to keep the bathwater, keep their understanding, keep their practice and strengths as a pedagogue, and apply it to adjusting the instructional content to meet students based on their readiness and maintaining the rigor of the lesson. We also know that there's some tension around how to teach the content. How do you differentiate? Which often results in teachers feeling like, I can't make this spicy and exciting and engaging for my students, resulting in disengagement. We're saying, not exactly. If you teach from a lens of integrity, you can maintain that level of engagement for your students and bringing in opportunities for cultural connection and experience for our kiddos. So if we can jump to our next slide, which is going to offer you the solution, the sword to slay this monster. We're thinking about this idea of intellectual preparation or intellectual prep. And the term is essentially an opportunity to think about, how are you internalizing a lesson? Lesson internalization, even if the lesson is already scripted and structured, means we're taking the information presented to us and making it applicable as well as relevant to our students. We as educators know our students and should be able to articulate how we can adjust the content to meet their socio-emotional and linguistics needs. Intellectual prep, or curricular literacy, as it's sometimes known, is the act of intentionally reading, processing, and digesting the instructional material so that you can give it to students in a way that is tangible and appropriate. It's approaching the lesson with an eye of critical thinking as well as criticality, which is in alignment with Gholdy Muhammad's 5 pursuits: skills, intellect, identity, criticality, and joy. By intellectually preparing a lesson, we are able to navigate many of the tensions that we just discussed that tend to arise with the adoption of high quality instructional materials.
So as you're pulling that up, Reshma, I just want to pause and name that what I'm continuing to hear when we talk about intellectual preparation is this sense of agency for teachers, is this idea that you still have agency to refine the materials to make it even more effective, even better than what you got. So elevating it, leveling up. That's what I'm hearing. Teachers have agency.
Teachers have agency, and if you're in a region that uses Danielson encourages that level of agency, so you're adapting it to students' needs. So just something to think about too, if we're a little worried about evaluations and that aspect as well. So our framework, which Equity Consulting Group developed internally for helping to unpack a lesson and making sure that teachers feel really comfortable, educators across the board, comfortable with the curriculum, is fourfold. The first is to read and process the information. You're just reading it. You're not doing anything else. And as you're reading it, you're thinking about what's the objective and what are students able to do at the end of this lesson based on what I'm reading and understanding. After you've read it and processed it, you then say, okay, what is the goal that I as a teacher have for this lesson based off of what I want my students to be able to do at the end of it? How will I know that they've mastered the skill and the learning target, right? How will I ensure the objective has been addressed? Then you'll pivot into the tangible rewriting, adjusting, modifying, ensuring alignment to standards and rigor, where you're borrowing and keeping elements of the lesson, but you're making accommodations for students as appropriate. And then finally, you'll refine the lesson so that it's ready to teach, whether it's putting it into your slide deck, whether it's going through with a coach, whether it's co-teaching it with a coach before you put it in front of students, whether it's finessing the handouts that you put in front of students. These are all, this simple linear approach is how you can really internalize a lesson. And the more you do it, the more it becomes second nature. You can take the same approach to unpacking a module or a unit plan as well.
I hear you saying like agency, adaption, etc. What advice would you give to those educators who maybe work in a district when they are told you can't adapt it, you have to teach it like as is? What advice would you give to them?
The first response that I have is probably a little glib, and I'm not going to give you that advice. I'm not going to give you that advice. What I would say to teachers is I would ask the question to those individuals who are telling me to teach it as is. Can you help me to understand, and can you maybe model for me what you mean by teaching it as is? That would be my first question. So like, I want to be able to meet your expectation of what you have of me as a teacher to implement this curriculum. Can you show me what you mean? Now, if that's not a possible, sincere question, not asking it to be sarcastic, if it's not possible to ask the person that question, I think there is space for teachers to say, okay, I have to teach this lesson as is. How am I going to modify, say, the text so that I meet my students' needs? How am I integrating other questions in addition to the questions that are here to help students understand the learning target? How am I creating maybe options for the existing assessment that meet my students' need? If I have students who are not currently proficient in English, but might have traditional literacy skills in their native language, how am I adjusting the assessment and the text to support them if I can't necessarily change or modify too much, right? If I have to do the fidelity approach versus the integrity approach. What do you think of that, Jacoby?
Yeah, I think that resonates a lot. I think another thing that we often tell people is like to think about how you can make the lesson connect to students' identity. So like, yeah, you're teaching it as is, but then how can you create those moments of like connection within the activities as well?
Like the opening and yeah. I mean, I was also thinking to answer that question about perhaps there's other spaces in the day where learning happens. That could be a study block, intervention blocks, right? What other small spaces can you create? You know, when students come to you during lunch or whatever they are, they typically happen in school days where you can have a bit more freedom. And then I would encourage those, this was probably your initial thought, Reshma, I would encourage those who are ready to take a little risk, small one, but take a risk. And then use data to back up your work, right? If you can show that students are excelling and proficient, that gives you license and some credibility, if you will, for the outcomes that we all want to be true. So your principal is going to want that to happen as well. And so using evidence as a way to kind of support modifications and changes, I think might be another recommendation.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. Thank you both for asking those really great questions that I'm sure our participants are also thinking about as well. I'm going to close out this section where we're exploring our monsters by bringing back our attention to a quote from EdReports that talks about the benefits of using high quality instructional materials. So this quote really emphasizes why HQIM, or high quality instructional materials, are important to a teacher's practice. By using high quality instructional materials, teachers are afforded the time to connect with families about their basic needs. Teachers can focus their attention on building in additional scaffolds, weaving in opportunities for differentiation, and finding supplemental text to build students' background knowledge and incorporate more diverse perspectives. So everything that Colleen and Jacoby just added to us thinking about when we're slaying this monster is what is captured in this quote. When we have HQIM, we can actually see it from an asset-based standpoint, ironically enough, and just modify our materials to give us the headspace to do other things that are going to have a more profound impact. And so on that note, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful participants in the chat. Given our monsters that we just explored, tell us, where are you coming in from and what's the spookiest challenge you've faced in teaching this year?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Colleen, did you say boo? Like a ghost?
I actually said ooh, but okay.
Okay.
Booze.
Ooh, can be like a spooky sound too, like
Spooky ooh. Yeah.
So we've got someone coming to us from Austin, Texas. So hello from Austin.
Hey,
My
Austin.
spookiest math challenge, trying to explain fractions to a room of 7th graders, felt like casting a spell that only a few could break. Thank you for leaning into the corniness. Thank you. Appreciate that. Translanguaging with multilingual learners during word problems added an extra layer of mystery. And as a recovering math phobe, I co-sign on that. I have a few others coming in.
Yeah, Rashma, I see one that equally leaned into our Halloween theme. And they're from New York. Greetings from New York. Hey, the scariest curricula challenge, balancing multiple standards with the spooky specter of state assessments looming over us. Ooh, that's a challenge for everyone. And with translanguaging, sometimes it seems like I'm juggling languages in a haunted circus. Wow.
Oh, wow.
That resonates so much.
I see quite a few coming in. I'm going to take one that says, hey, from Miami. Shout out to Miami. Y'all have been going through it with the hurricane. So I hope all is well down south and that the sun is coming out and shining on you. This one says the spookiest curricular challenge is making sure the math shifts don't vanish in translation, again, for my multilingual learners. Felt like trying to crack a code in a haunted house. Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing those and being vulnerable and sharing what challenges really are keeping you up at night and resonating with you. We really appreciate that. And keep them coming. Keep your responses coming, and we'll be able to look at them a little later. All right. So I think we're going to move into our second segment, y'all. We ready? Okay. Trick or treat. Can you guess who was resistant to the theme of Halloween?
And can you guess who ate it up?
Right. I'm like, let me get into it. All right, so this segment is going to be kind of a quick rapid fire. We're going to look at several scenarios and we're going to weigh in as to whether or not they are tricks, there's a trick involved, or whether it's a treat. And yep, that works, that makes sense for inclusion and furthering equity. Yeah, so that's what we're going to jump into now. So feel free to drop in the chat your thoughts, your premonitions, your predictions about each scenario. All right. So scenario one. All right. So scenario one says you are a department leader coaching a group of teachers to improve their learning environment and effectiveness. Sounds like what we do, right, with a lot of novice teachers. You decide to prioritize identity and equity development for the first quarter to make some strategic improvements in just the culture of your department. After your first session, a handful of teachers shows up to your principal's office complaining. Why are we doing this? What is this for? How does this relate to, what we need to teach and the test? And so, as a new department leader, you don't want to rock the boat. You decide to just pause the initiative. Trick or treat?
I would say trick. So many things are hard in teaching and in education. And often it's like learning from those hard things that make us a better teacher, a better educator, etc. And I would have preferred the educator help make connections from the trainings to the teacher's work. But I think just abandoning it, is a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a trick. I think we have experienced this in our work. Because as an organization, we always operate from a lens of DEI, inclusion, anti-racism. And it just naturally lends itself to our coaching practices and leadership support work. And so when we've come across these situations, we find the workaround. We still manage to make it front and center. But this is definitely a trick.
And I will say that when folks move through that hard work of those discussions, there's always gems on the other side for the school community.
That's so true. If you push through. And I think that's why the way we orient to work and kind of centering humans and, collecting data, the same way we model for teachers, right? We want to learn from the data and adjust and adapt as much as possible. And so making sure folks feel heard and seen in the process and know that we got them, right? And we're going to work through some hard stuff. But as you said, Jacoby, on the other side of that is aha moments, right? It's huge shifts in culture and instruction and learning and in student performance. So definitely a trick. Keep pushing. All right. Scenario 2. Next slide. This one says, I teach 9th grade algebra and kids don't remember for the life of them how to solve for the unknown in a one-step equation. I feel like I need to pause and go back and teach the fundamentals for middle school in order for them to get this content, or else they'll never get it. Trick or treat?
I would say a trick. I feel like as educators, we balance so many things, so many different student levels, etc. And oftentimes it's folks hunch to reteach things from the lower grades. Folks are widening the opportunity gap and not giving students the opportunity to try it out. And oftentimes with scaffolds and access points, students will get there.
Definitely a trick. I agree with everything that Jacoby said. And it's making me think of the New Teacher Project recently did, or it's not recent, it was about 4 years ago after COVID.
Yeah.
Accelerate versus remediate. And in thinking about high quality instructional materials, if we are modifying the content to meet our students where they are based on their readiness, there's no reason the whole class needs to go back and learn 2 + 2 = 4, right? It equals 4. Yeah, but but there's no need for that, right?
Actually, on the next slide, I was thinking about that same thing as we kind of were mulling over these scenarios and highlighting that opportunity myth, that research paper that TNTP published a couple of years ago, and really looking at the disparity, right? So as we think about equity, making that move that we think kind of looks right and is what students need, really creates this dilemma and this disparity in our system. And so what they found is that students show up willing to do the work, right? And they believe and expect that schools are going to set them up to reach the goals that they want for themselves. And they found that 88% of the time, students are working on activities related to class, as they should. 71% of the time, students met expectations of assignments that they were given to do. And in general, they fared pretty well in like their class grades. The conundrum is that when we look at the other graph, that bar graph, what they also found is that although in general, all students tended to succeed when they were given grade level appropriate work, those two bars on the left shows or compares success rates on grade level appropriate work between schools that were predominantly serving white students and schools with mostly students of color. And you found that generally they were close to the same around, whether or not they can be successful when given grade level appropriate work. Where you see the disparity is on the other side, on the right side, it says, but 4 out of 10 classrooms with the majority of students of color never even received a single grade level assignment. So what does that tell us? What is happening in schools? I think that's huge. That's I'm trying to do the math. I'm 26% gap in the opportunity. So that's why they name it the opportunity myth, right? It is a myth that all students have the opportunity to exceed and excel when we look at data like this. And so we have to be really careful about the choices we make with instruction and that 45 to 90 minute block of time we have, that we are always and continuously pushing rigorous grade level work and helping students to kind of scaffold and build up to that bar, and not going the other direction of we have to bring the bar down to meet the students. So I think that is a really important one. And we have the link to the actual report that we will drop in the chat as well. All right, I think we have 2 more scenarios. Next one up, scenario 3, trick or treat. Students are often checked out in the middle of class. They put their heads down often. And so as a teacher, you get curious, right? You decide to do a listening tour to learn more about why this is happening. You start by giving an anonymous survey to gauge student perception. Trick or treat.
I think that's a trait that I would want to take with me. Listening to students, and then even more importantly, acting upon what you heard them say, not only builds educator-student relationships, a sense of trust, a sense of belonging even maybe, and it provides opportunities for the educator to adjust course in ways that will increase engagement in the class. So I think that's definitely a treat.
I definitely think it's a trait as well. I think in addition to everything Jacoby named, when we exist within systems, particularly the education system, there's a dehumanization that tends to happen because of the roles that we get assigned. So teacher is not seen as a human with feelings. Students are not seen as young people who are still struggling to figure out their identity. And so the treat of being able to listen to children and hear them share about their experiences is just so profound. Yeah.
You really learn information that you wouldn't otherwise know, right? And so the next slide just shows a quick kind of way or tool to map what you hear. And this can be found in the organizational tools that Mural has. And so if you can take a look at the quadrants, it just allows you, if you're hearing, let's say from 5 students, it allows you to map and look for trends across what they say or what they said. I need glasses, y'all. What's the other one? Thinks. Right? What they share about what they think, what they feel, and then what they do, right? And so this one is about Gabrielle, a specific student. And so this allows you as a teacher to really step back and be objective and to look for patterns and trends across what you're hearing from students directly. And to Jacoby's point, adjust course. Adjust course. Let them know that you heard them and here's what's going to be different. So I love this as a tool. All right, our last scenario. All right, so this is your second year teaching a curriculum, and you teach it word for word based upon the expectations. You notice, however, that 30% of your students consistently are doing great. They're getting 90s and above. So you decide to focus on those that need the most help, right? Assuming that you've done your job with the group that's excelling. Is this a trick or a treat?
I think this is a tricky trick that reminds me of the myth of average.
Reshma, for those who may not know, do you want to say more about the myth of average?
Well, actually, I think Colleen's going to kind of get into it.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it's a little bit of a trick because, yay, we want to celebrate those kids that are always killing it, doing well. And yes, we need to focus and give intentional instruction to those that are still on their journey. But learning never stops, right? And every learner needs something. They need what they need to continue to learn. And so we can't kind of neglect the 30%. And so we should think about how are we also challenging them to continue to grow as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that TED Talk from Todd Rose, which is amazing. I use it all the time in my practice because it really helps to profoundly shift the way you think about students, I would say academic achievement, ability, and what's possible. And he talks about this idea of jagged learning profiles and that every student, every human has a jagged learning profile. And what that means is that our learning and our needs are really context dependent. It can depend on the content that you're learning, right? You may need something different or visual, let's say, if you are learning about measurement and data analysis, you need to see it. However, if you're working on a unit, who knows, fractions, you might need to touch it, you might need to create it, right? Other topics, you might want that list of like, what are the mechanics of doing this and like why? So it really also, I should name, as we've kind of touched on a little bit, that kind of social emotional piece. You might just be having a bad day. How about that? We have those, right? And students also have those. So maybe on that particular day, you may need something different than you need on another day. And so really being attuned to students and their needs is critical here. And I just want to name that, like that idea of learning styles that probably we grew up with as teachers and were taught, that framework, that theory has been debunked, right? It is not true that you get put in one bucket, right? I'm a visual learner, and so for everything I need a picture. That's just not how we function as humans, and that's not what brain science and psychology tells us is true. And so it's a lot more nuanced than that, and figuring out on a given topic or day, what is that jagged learning profile? And so that 30%, they got something they need to work on. They have something that they need to improve. Right? So how are we going to stretch their thinking and kind of reward success with success to make sure they are whole as they move forward, as we're also intervening and remediating and continuing that journey for others. So awesome. Thank you. Oh, we're also going to drop that link to that TED Talk that we talked about with Todd Rose, so you can feel free to watch that on your own time. But thank you. Yay. Trick or treat. We did 4 That was fun. I do have to admit that was kind of fun. I'm going to pass it back to, I think, Reshma, maybe closing us out. And perhaps you'll hear again from Jacoby.
All right, guys. So thank you to everyone who chose to join us this evening. and to just sit with us and experience our slaying journey as we slay these monsters and put them to rest. And yeah, we're just really happy to have had you with us. We have a couple of minutes for any questions that folks might have. So let's just take a moment to see what might be coming into the chat. We've got a question coming in here for Jacoby. What challenges have you encountered when balancing translanguaging with district mandated curriculum?
Yeah, the beauty about translanguaging is that it's curriculum agnostic. So that's the beauty in it. And some curriculums, in terms of having instructional materials in different languages, make it much easier than others, right? Like some don't have Mandarin or various language, and obviously the ones that do is so much easier.
Yeah.
But the translanguaging, like those unplanned moments are agnostic. And then with the curriculum, I recommend also like leaning into your community of educators, right? Like I'm at a school now where there's multiple Mandarin dual language schools there, and the curriculum doesn't come in Mandarin, but they're like crowdsourcing from their peers to save time on texts and videos, resources, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the first two things that come to mind.
Thanks so much, Jacoby, for that answer. It's definitely one that comes up a lot, especially with districts and schools implementing HQIM that is outside of their locus of control.
No, I was about to say, I see another one here, and this is a good one. And it's for you, Reshma. It's coming from a district principal and naming that they're noticing just a shift in capacity with teachers, novice teachers, but also over the last few years around the interest in developing lesson plans, or like kind of that rigor, that habit of practice of like, oh, you're supposed to plan to teach what you're going to teach.
Right, imagine.
Yeah. And so he is curious about what type of professional learning opportunities we provide to help kind of build that capacity, and what might it look like to scaffold it. How do we kind of build that up for teachers in a school?
So a lot of that work comes through our like direct instructional coaching, where we meet with teachers on a consistent cadence and develop their capacity by giving them a set of tools. And those tools are technical tools and adaptive in nature as well, to help them think about, well, what are you going to teach? Do you understand the standards? What is the scope and sequence? What is the end of unit assessment? Kind of chunking and unpacking these things in a very strategic manner so they understand the trajectory of where they're going, and developing a cadence for their own personal planning and structure that doesn't feel overwhelming. I will say this new generation of teachers, they are big proponents of work-life balance. And, how do I do this level of planning that is expected of me in a way that is healthy and sustainable? And so we definitely meet them where they are and strategically structure our planning conversations around, okay, well, what do you know? How are we working with you to address what you don't know? And then what are we making sure we're putting in front of students and giving our best and our 100% level of effort?
And I think one part of our work that I love is working with teacher leaders and helping them to kind of maximize their PLC time in departments, and kind of creating an arc of development and a journey where teachers can learn those discrete skills in the building during the school day and kind of show proficiency along the way, right? And particularly if they have high quality instructional materials, then that work becomes different. I wouldn't say easier, it becomes a different lens. And really being focused on like, what are we adapting the lesson for this month, right? How are we kind of building those competencies so that in short order, you have lessons that are really robust, but are able to be done in a sustainable way. And once, we find that clients in schools kind of do the rigorous, kind of treacherous work of a year, you really have a strong foundation to then tweak and build on and adjust. Yeah, it's usually in that that first year grind, that's hard.
And it takes like a good 5 years for a lot of things to really stick and grow and flourish. And so whether it's 5 years as a teacher, 5 years as with curriculum, 5 years for school turnaround. Like, it's like all the research is showing that's like the magic number.
But sadly, things don't stick around that long. It seems like it's like a swinging pendulum.
Yeah, that feels like forever, right? Education. Awesome. Thanks for the questions. Keep them coming again. We'll be able to hopefully answer some offline as well. And Jacoby, you want to close us out?
Sure. So thank you for all joining us for our webinar panel today. If you have any inquiries or you're interested in any of our services, we do instructional coaching, district coaching, leadership coaching, curriculum development. Y'all, we do it all. So if you have a need, we can probably help you out. Please reach out to partnerships at Equity Consulting Group. And then all of our individual emails are listed here as well. You can also find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I might be missing something, but yes.
What's the X one? X is Twitter.
Twitter. Yes. All right. Well, so with that, we're signing off. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.